Hey guys, it's been a while, and I'm sorry about that, but we are going to talk about today Babe Ruth. I have a few things that I wanted to say about him, and I just haven't been making as many videos. I've had a lot of ideas. The ideas are sometimes it feels like limitless, and sometimes not, but I definitely have a lot of ideas. But today we're going to talk about something a little bit different. And I referred to, I believe, in my last video that Tom Brady was the greatest player of all time, and I did specifically mean that he is the greatest NFL player of all time. And it could be debated who's the greatest winner of all time, or the greatest player of all time. But we're going to talk about Babe Ruth here in just a second. But let me go over the other players. If you're referring to the greatest hitter of all time, for like OPS, doubles in the gap, placement, home runs, power, all of that, that would definitely be Ted Williams. If you're talking about the greatest base runner of all time, you're talking about Ty Cobb. You're talking about on base percentage, greatest hitter of all time, just for singles, Ty Cobb again. The greatest ball handler of all time, we'd be talking about Pete Maravich by far. If you have 1 second on the clock, the greatest clutch DNA shooter of all time, definitely Larry Bird, second Reggie Miller. So it goes on and on and on. The greatest winner of all time in baseball, Yogi Berra. The greatest winner of all time in any sport, I believe, is Bill Russell. But Bill Russell, if you look at him, he played in the 60s, mostly 50s and 60s. And, all hats off to him for winning in the environment that he was given. But Bill Russell did win sometimes when there was only like 6 teams, 8 teams, 9 teams. And I think there wasn't even 10 or 12 teams until his last two or 3 years in the league. And he did continue to win even when there was 10 and 12 teams. But eight out of his 11 championships did come when there was only like 8 and 9 teams in the league. And I think a couple of them with even 6 teams in the league. So the other sports don't quite have the history that baseball has. So, we can go on and on and on. I do think Tom Brady is the greatest football player of all time. And that's for another video, but I could give you probably 20 or 30 different bullet points about why he's the greatest NFL player of all time. Greatest basketball player of all time, not sure. Hockey player, maybe Gordie Howe. It could be debated. I haven't really gotten into hockey, but I think when you go into every single sport and you look at the greatest player of all time, basketball, football, hockey, baseball, all of these sports, soccer included, tennis, you could go on and on and on and on and on. I think maybe one of the greatest players of all time could be Margaret Court, the tennis player who has 24 Grand Slam championships. I've studied her a little bit, and so she has pretty much the greatest winning record. And she did, if you look at the Open era and when she played and the competition she was playing against, and every detail about the history of Margaret Court, it could be debated that she is the greatest winner of all time. But the greatest player of all time, I would say it's Babe Ruth. Uh, Believe me, I've considered like Smokey Joe Wood's perfect year in 1912. I've considered Walter Johnson, George Sisler, on and on and on. Cy Young. Cy Young's winning record of 512 wins is so amazing. That's for another video, but I wanted to spend a lot of time letting you know about my thought process because I do like to think about these things. And it's not just like saying Babe Ruth is the greatest player of all time. I actually, I like to think about it. And so let me go into it. It'll probably take about 5 minutes, but let me go into why I think that Babe Ruth is the greatest player of all time. Not only did he have 7 championships, and not only did he have one of the highest batting averages and on-base percentages of all time and hit for power, but let's talk about stuff like how many home runs would he have had? If you have a time machine and you put Babe Ruth into today's game, would he have hit less, more, same amount of home runs? How many would he have hit? Now, if he were born in today's era and trained in today's era, it'd be different. But if you put, let's say, a 15-year-old Babe Ruth in today's game, how would he have done? And I say that he would have hit about 900 home runs or really close to it. He would not have hit 1,000 and he would not have hit 800. He would have hit probably around 870, 890, even close to 900 home runs, which would make him the greatest hitter of all time. And what makes him the greatest player is that he was a pitcher. So he could have been kind of like a Shohei Ohtani. He could have been a two-sided ball player. And he could have been a position player, a pitcher, and as you can see in one of the pictures, he could have been a catcher. He could have done it all. He could have fielded the ball. He could have pitched. He could have batted. He could do everything. He could have called the game. So anyway, he played in a time where he was kind of a dichotomy of a person. And what I mean by that is that, he was raised in an orphanage. And so he had a very troubled youth. He was struggling with a lot of issues. And if you put him into a time machine at, let's say, 15 years old with that same personality and characteristics, but if you'd given him the nutrition, he was basically having to, scratch and claw his way up to get to the top. Whereas in today's game, they're kind of more trained and coddled and like the right, fitness regimen, nutrition, all the obvious stuff. But let me mention a few things that weren't so obvious. Number one, thank God he played back then because we know that he was a great pitcher and a great fielder and everything. But he would have been utilized a little bit differently in today's game. He would have been utilized more as a hitter. And if you look at the era or the area of his game between 1915, 16, 17, 18, and 19, for those 6 years, he only had 20 home runs because he was misutilized. And so you can add, let's say you add during those 6 years, 20, let's go soft. Let's say 30 home runs a year during those 6 years. That's 180 minus, let's say minus those 20 that he actually hit. So that's 160. So to 714 home runs that he had, you can add 160, which would put him near 865. Also due to nutrition and being in like fancy hotels and, night games and perfect lighting and, they would literally give him the perfect, just matched him so well nowadays. They would all have it weighted and trained, and he could have videotape to watch the other pitchers, what they're throwing, and he'd be able to study them. And he would have a smaller strike zone because back then they had the strike zone, up to the chest, which is why you see the catchers crouching instead of kneeling down. But there was a taller strike zone back then. And so by having a smaller strike zone, he would have hit more home runs also. And the end of his career with nutrition and sleeping well and being, in luxury buses and all that stuff, air conditioning, the end of his career would have lasted a little bit longer too. And so let's say 2-3 more years, add another 80 to that. It could be debated. And that he would have had even 940 home runs at that point, 950. So it's a lot of what ifs. It's a lot of woulda, coulda, shoulda. But I think that I've made my argument, deep enough where people can see. Also, another thing. There's a book called "The Year That Babe Ruth Would Have Hit 100 Home Runs." It's an interesting book. I have never get a copy of it, but I've read the synopsis of it and what it's about. And it was saying if the fields back then, somebody actually looked at every single bat at bat, I believe, of his 1927 season and looked at where all the balls landed because they were tracking it to a degree back then. And they said if people had had, or not people, but if stadiums had had the symmetrical outfield, that these balls wouldn't have been doubles and triples, that these balls would have been home runs. And if he hadn't played in the Polo Grounds with that 490-foot center field, those balls would have been home runs. So it was very interesting to think about. It's very interesting to think about. But I do think that, considering that people like Walter Johnson and Smokey Joe Wood and Bob Feller have been throwing 100 or near 100 since probably 1903, it's pretty interesting. Oh, and additionally, the curveball was invented in 1870. It's pretty interesting to think about the fact that I believe that Babe Ruth would have not only survived, he would have thrived in today's game. I think he would have hit even more home runs in today's game, to finish my argument. But back then, if he'd been utilized correctly, like I said, it could be debated and back and forth. But back then, if he'd been utilized correctly, if they had better lighting, if they had night games, nutrition, if his career had been extended, it could be debated that he would have hit anywhere from 860 to 945 home runs. And that's what I think makes him the greatest player of all time in any sport. And the fact that, he played catcher for a while, he played pitcher, he played left field, he played right field. The fact that he had a troubled childhood, he had all the chips going against him. And to create what he did in the situation that he was given is truly amazing. And one other thing I want to say, even though he did, drink and smoke cigars and womanize and all that stuff, I don't really hold that against him personally. And here's the reason why. He was good to children. And he just had this warm, loving side. And you can't really blame, with his childhood and the traumas that he went through, you can't blame him for having a wild, uncontrollable side. His personality was developed by his childhood, and there's nothing you can really do about personality. But the side that I've heard about through family that have seen him, and the way he treated children, is he was just such a wonderful person. And at the end of this video, I'm just going to say I do think that Babe Ruth is the greatest player in any sport of all time. And that's including, let's say, cricket, tennis, hockey, basketball, soccer, every sport you can think of. So we can talk about who's the best ball dribbler and all that in other videos, which I've alluded to earlier in this video. But when you cross every sport, I do believe that Babe Ruth is the greatest cross sport of any era of all time. And it's not just because popular opinion thinks that. I truly think that from the bottom of my heart. And anyway, that's my video, and hopefully you liked it, and take care.